The first bullet punched through the stagecoach wall just an inch from Elena Hayes' head. The sound wasn't a crack of thunder, it was a sharp, dry pop, like a bone snapping. Then came the thunder, the roar of a dozen rifles echoing off the canyon walls, turning the peaceful Colorado Rockies into a shooting gallery. Horses screamed a sound you never forget, high and thin and full of terror. Men shouted, their voices swallowed by the chaos. The whole world lurched sideways as the coach's wheels bit into loose rock, splintering wood and sending a spray of lead and dust into the cramped carriage. Elena clutched the seat in front of her, her knuckles white. Her heart wasn't just pounding, it was trying to escape, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The air turned thick with the smell of gunpowder, acrid and bitter, stinging her eyes and coating her tongue. She watched, frozen, as the driver pitched from his seat, a puppet with its strings cut. The reins went flying, and the coach slammed to a halt against a sheer rock face with a groan of dying wood. The driver's body crumpled in the dirt, a broken thing. And then the wolves descended. They came on horseback, their faces hidden behind red bandanas and the wide brims of their hats. They didn't shout demands. They didn't ask for valuables. They just opened fire. Elena heard the screams of the other passengers, an elderly couple heading west. A young man named Clark who'd been talking about the silver mines. Their voices were there 1 second and gone the next, snuffed out with a brutal, shocking finality. She threw herself to the floorboards, her mind a spinning vortex of disbelief. She was 23 years old, trained in medicine, a daughter of Boston who believed she could be useful out here. She'd prepared for hardship, for sickness, for the raw, lonely edge of the frontier. But this wasn't hardship. This was slaughter. A heavy hand ripped the coach door open. The smell of sweat and unwashed leather flooded the small space. Through a crack in the splintered wood, she saw one of them bend over the old man, tearing a small iron box from his cold hands. Gold coins spilled out, glinting like evil eyes in the fading sun. A rough voice barked an order. "Search the others." Elena's blood ran cold. She tried to make herself smaller, flatter, pressing her face against the dirty floor. She tried to stop breathing. Her father once told her that terror freezes you or makes you thrash. She felt both at once, a statue trembling from the inside out. Heavy boots scraped closer. A shadow fell across the doorway, blotting out the light. He leaned in, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. They were dark, narrowed, and they found her in an instant. In that instant, her fear exploded. With a strangled cry, she launched herself from the floor, shoving past him with all her might. He swore, grabbing for her arm, but she was slick with panic and twisted free, stumbling out into the open canyon. A gunshot cracked. Not thunder this time, but a white-hot whip that tore through her thigh. Her leg buckled. She hit the ground hard, her palms scraping raw on the gravel, the breath knocked out of her in a choked sob. "Got her!" someone shouted. Pain was a fire spreading through her veins, but she scrambled back to her feet. She ran, a clumsy, stumbling, limping run, deeper into the shadows of the canyon. Blood poured down her leg, warm and sticky, soaking through her skirt. She bit her lip until she tasted the iron tang of her own blood, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scream. The canyon twisted, and she dove behind a massive boulder, her back slamming against the cold stone. The setting sun was painting the cliffs a deep, bloody red. Her hands shook so violently she could barely pull the small pistol from her travel bag. It was a flimsy thing, hardly reliable, but it was the only thing connecting her to the world of the living. She could hear them coming, their bootsteps echoing off the rocks. They were hunting her. The fire in her leg was threatening to consume her. She pressed a hand to the wound, her own medical training a useless whisper in the back of her mind. She thought of her father, of his praise for her steady hands. Those same hands were shaking uncontrollably now. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision, and then she heard it. Hoofbeats, but not the frantic pounding of the outlaws' horses. This was a slower, more measured rhythm, a single rider. Elena forced her eyes open, her pistol clutched in her hand. If it was another one of them, she would take him with her. A tall figure on a chestnut stallion emerged from the shadows. The man's silhouette was framed against the glowing canyon rim. his shoulders broad beneath a dark coat. As he got closer, she saw it, a faint glint of metal on his chest, a sheriff's badge. He dismounted, holding his hands out in a gesture of peace. His voice was deep, steady, a rock in the middle of her raging fear. "Easy there," he said. "You're bleeding bad, miss." She tried to aim the pistol, but her arm felt like it was made of lead. "Stay back," she gasped. "I'll shoot." "I believe you would," he replied, his voice calm, unshaken. He took a single step closer, and the last rays of sunlight caught his face. It was a weathered face, a strong jaw dusted with stubble, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds. "But I've got water, bandages, and a fair hand at patching bullet wounds. You won't last long without help." Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to run, but her vision was tunneling to a pinpoint of black. Her knees gave out. The pistol slipped from her fingers, clattering against the stone. He moved in a blur, catching her before she hit the ground. His arms were strong, surprisingly gentle. His voice was a low murmur against the chaos in her head. "My name's Daniel Carter," he said, shifting her against his chest. "Sheriff out of Aspen Ridge. You're safe now." Her lips trembled. "It hurts," she managed to whisper. "Too much." Daniel glanced at the dark stains spreading across her skirt. He tightened his hold, his voice quiet, almost solemn. "That's why I'm here." He lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing. With the last of the sun at his back, he rode deeper into the pines away from the slaughter. He was carrying a wounded woman toward a hidden cabin, and a future neither of them could possibly imagine. A future built on a lie that was about to unravel. Daniel's horse moved with a swift, steady rhythm, carrying them away from the echoes of death. Elena drifted in and out of a haze of pain, her head resting against the solid wall of his chest. The thrum of his heartbeat was a constant grounding rhythm beneath her ear. The world was a blur of pine trees and deepening shadows. She knew somewhere in the fog that this stranger was all that stood between her and a shallow grave in the canyon. The trail climbed, and when the stars finally broke through the canopy, a small cabin appeared, a single lantern glowing in its window like a promise. He swung down and lifted her into his arms. She was barely conscious, a dead weight, but he carried her inside as if he'd done it 100 times before. The cabin was a single room, warm and smelling of pine smoke. He laid her gently on a narrow bed covered with a patchwork quilt. "You're safe here," he said, his voice that same steady rumble. "But we've got to get that bullet out before it festers." Her eyes fluttered open. You know how?" He didn't answer right away. He just moved around the small space with a practiced economy, pulling a bottle of whiskey from a shelf, laying out clean cloths, a long-bladed knife. "I was an Army field medic years ago," he finally said, his back to her. "I'll manage." She tried to focus, the words slurring. "I'm trained too. Medicine. In Boston." The pain surged and her voice broke. "I know what happens." A flicker of something crossed Daniel's face. Respect, maybe. "Then you know I'm not lying about the danger." He poured whiskey into a cup and held it to her lips. "Drink, as much as you can stand." The liquor was fire, burning a path down her throat. She coughed, tears stinging her eyes, but she drank again. She watched him heat the knife blade in the lamp flame, his hands perfectly steady, too steady. He held out a strip of leather. "You'll need to bite on this." He eased the belt between her teeth and knelt beside her. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms corded with muscle and old white scars. His storm cloud eyes met hers. "Hold on," he murmured. "I'll be quick." The first cut was lightning. It was a white-hot agony that tore a scream from her, a scream that was muffled by the leather in her teeth. She arched off the bed, her world dissolving into pure, unadulterated pain. But through it all, Daniel's voice was there, a low, constant anchor in the storm, reminding her to breathe. His hands never faltered. He worked with a brutal efficiency, probing for the shard of lead lodged deep in her muscle. Sweat beaded on his brow, but his focus was absolute. Just as she felt herself slipping into the black, she heard him say, "Got it." A metallic clink in a bowl was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Relief came in a ragged sob. She tasted blood where she'd bitten through the leather. Daniel worked fast, cleaning the wound, stitching it closed with rough, precise movements. When he tied the final knot, the first pale light of dawn was creeping across the cabin floor. He sat back, the exhaustion finally showing on his face. "It's done," he said, wiping his hands. "You'll hurt like the devil, but you'll live." Her voice was a dry rasp. "Why? Why help me?" Daniel's eyes shadowed over. The silence stretched, thick and heavy in the small room. Then he spoke, his voice low, tinged with an old, cold grief. "I lost my wife and daughter to men like those. Stagecoach robbery, 8 years back. I wasn't there to save them. Maybe saving you makes up for something." Her heart ached for him. She reached out a weak hand, her fingers brushing his. "Those men," she whispered, "they slaughtered everyone." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then it seems we both know what it is to be hunted by ghosts." In the days that followed, her strength returned in small, painful increments. Daniel was a constant, quiet presence. He tended the fire, cooked stew, and changed her bandages with a surprising gentleness. She guided him, insisting on boiled water and clean cloths, her medical training a fragile link to the person she used to be. They talked, filling the silence with stories of Boston winters and Texas cattle drives. But she noticed things. The cabin was too well hidden, too perfectly stocked. It wasn't a sheriff's outpost. It was a bolt hole. He never seemed surprised by anything, and he always stood by the window at dusk, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, his eyes scanning the trees. He wasn't just a man haunted by ghosts. He was a man expecting company. One evening, the wind howled around the cabin, rattling the door in its frame. Daniel finally said the words she'd been dreading. "They'll come looking, Elena. A man like Silas Crow, he doesn't leave loose ends." Her heart hammered in her chest. "Which means this isn't just your fight anymore," he continued, his eyes locking with hers. "It's mine too." She should have felt relief, a sense of alliance. But instead, a cold dread trickled down her spine. It was the way he said the name. Silas Crow. Not like a lawman speaking of an outlaw. More like family. That night she couldn't sleep. The pain in her leg was a dull throb, but the unease in her mind was sharp as a knife. While Daniel slept, a deep, unnervingly still sleep, she slipped out of bed. Limping, using the wall for support, she made her way to his saddlebags, which he'd slung over a chair in the corner. Her fingers trembled as she unbuckled the leather straps. Inside she found ammunition, a whetstone, some dried beef, and at the very bottom, tucked into a folded oilskin cloth, was a stack of papers. They weren't legal documents or letters from home. They were wanted posters. 3 of them, for 3 of the men from the canyon. She recognized their faces from the split second she'd seen them before they pulled up their bandanas. And beneath them, there was a 4th poster. The face was younger, angrier, but she recognized the storm cloud eyes immediately. The name printed in stark black letters was not Daniel Carter. It was Daniel Crow. And right next to it, the words she'd never forget. Wanted, dead or alive. For robbery and murder. Associate of the Silas Crow gang. The man who had saved her life wasn't a sheriff. He was one of them. And she was trapped in his cabin, miles from anywhere, with a bullet hole in her leg and a killer sleeping just a few feet away. The wanted poster felt like ice in her hand, freezing the blood in her veins. Daniel Crow, her savior, her captor. She looked over at the man sleeping in the chair, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm, a monster sleeping the sleep of the just. Her breath hitched, a tiny, betraying sound in the quiet cabin. His eyes snapped open. He didn't startle or sit up. He just watched her from the shadows, his storm gray eyes holding no warmth, no sympathy, only a cold, hard assessment. "You should have stayed in bed, Elena." His voice was different now. The gentle rumble was gone, replaced by something flat and dangerous. She didn't try to hide the poster. She let it drop to the floor. "Who are you?" "You already know," he said, rising slowly from the chair. He moved with a predator's grace, every line of his body tense. "I'm the man who's going to decide whether you live or die." Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She backed away, her injured legs screaming in protest. Silas Crow, he's your brother. He is, Daniel said, his face a mask of stone. I was supposed to be with him at that canyon. Got held up. By the time I got there, all I found was bodies and you. He took another step closer. My brother doesn't like witnesses, and he really doesn't like surprises. You're both. So this was it. The kindness, the story about his wife and daughter, all of it was a lie. A calculated performance to keep her docile until he could deliver her to his murderous brother. She was nothing but a loose end to be tied up, a piece on his bloody chessboard. What are you going to do with me? She whispered, her voice trembling. I'm going to take you to him, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You're my ticket back in, proof that I'm still loyal. The hope that had been a tiny flickering flame in her chest was extinguished, plunged into icy darkness. She was a prisoner. Again. But this was worse. The men in the canyon had been strangers. This man had touched her, tended to her wound, spoken to her with a voice that promised safety. The betrayal was a poison more potent than any bullet. He saw the fight drain out of her, replaced by a dull, horrifying resignation. A flicker of something. Was it pity? Regret? Crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He pulled a length of rope from his saddlebags. We ride at dawn. He bound her hands in front of her, his movements quick and efficient. The rope bit into her wrists. He pushed her gently but firmly toward the bed. Get some rest. You'll need it. Rest? How could she rest? Her mind was racing, searching for an escape, any way out of this nightmare. But the cabin was a fortress. One door, one window, and a man who was clearly as dangerous as his reputation suggested. She lay on the bed, her back to him, every muscle screaming with tension. She listened to him moving around the cabin, the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the clink of metal as he cleaned his guns. This was a man preparing for a journey that would end with her death. But as the hours ticked by, a new feeling began to smolder beneath the fear. Anger, a hot, burning rage. She was not a lamb to be led to the slaughter. She was a survivor. She had survived the massacre at the canyon. She had survived a bullet wound. She would survive Daniel Crow. Her mind, trained to think logically, to diagnose, to solve problems, began to work. She couldn't overpower him. She couldn't outrun him. But she knew things he didn't. She knew the workings of the human body. She knew its weaknesses. The plan that formed was desperate, a long shot, but it was all she had. She waited. She forced her breathing to even out, mimicking sleep. She listened as his movements stilled, as the cabin fell into a deep, waiting silence. Then she began to moan, a low, pained sound. Daniel, she whispered, her voice thick with fake delirium. My leg, it's on fire. He was by her side in an instant, the concerned sheriff back in his voice. What is it? The wound, she gasped, letting her body begin to tremble. It's burning. I think it's infected. She let her eyes roll back in her head slightly, her limbs starting to twitch in small, jerky movements. It was a passable imitation of septic convulsions. She'd seen it enough times in the wards back in Boston. He cursed under his breath. He needed her alive, presentable for Silas. A dying, feverish woman was no use to him. Hold still, he ordered, his voice tight with frustration. He reached for the bandages on her leg. To do that, he had to lean over her. And to do that properly, he needed both hands. He untied her wrists. It was the moment she'd been waiting for. The fire poker was still resting in the hearth, its tip glowing a dull, angry red from the dying embers. As his hands busied themselves with her bandage, she moved. She wasn't a Boston lady anymore. She was a cornered animal. She snatched the hot poker from the hearth and swung it with all her might. The poker connected with his side with a sickening hiss of burning flesh and fabric. He roared in pain and shock, stumbling backward, clutching his side. That was all the time she needed. She scrambled for the door, her legs screaming in agony. She threw the bolt, ripped the door open, and plunged out into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold air hit her like a slap in the face. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds of Daniel's enraged shouts echoing behind her. She was wounded, alone, and being hunted by a man who knew every inch of these mountains. The game had changed. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was prey. The forest was a maze of black trees and deep shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. Ilelanena ran, fueled by pure adrenaline, ignoring the fire in her leg and the burning in her lungs. She could hear him behind her, not close but there, a steady, relentless presence. He wasn't crashing through the woods like she was. He was moving with a tracker's skill, and she knew he would be patient. He would wear her down. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in pale shades of gray and pink, but it brought no comfort. The light only made her feel more exposed. She had to find a place to hide, to think. She spotted a narrow crevice in a rock face, almost completely hidden by a thicket of overgrown bushes. Squeezing through the thorns, she tumbled into the small, dark space, pulling the branches closed behind her. She pressed her back against the cold, damp stone and finally allowed herself to breathe. Her leg was a throbbing knot of agony. The wound had reopened, and fresh blood was soaking her tattered skirt. She was losing strength and fast. But as she sat there listening, a new sound reached her. Not Daniel's footsteps. It was the sound of multiple horses moving at a steady clip along a trail somewhere below her position. Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, flickered in her chest. Was it travelers? A posse? She had to risk it. Peeking through a gap in the bushes, she saw them. 3 riders, and the sun glinted off the badge of the man in the lead. Lawmen, she nearly cried out in relief, but something held her back. The memory of Daniel's fake badge. She watched them, her heart pounding. The lead rider was a tall, older man with a grim, weathered face. He held up a hand, and the group halted directly below her hiding spot. "He's close," the lead lawman said, his voice a low growl. "Cooper, you smell anything?" A grizzled, silent man next to him dismounted and knelt, studying the ground. He pointed a finger toward the woods, in the direction of Daniel's cabin. 2 sets of tracks. One's the woman from the telegram, running hard. The other is him. "Good," the lead lawman said. "He thinks he's the hunter. Let's remind him what it feels like to be hunted. Spread out. I want him boxed in. Dead or alive, the bounty's the same." Bounty. The word hit Elelanena like a physical blow. They weren't here to rescue her. They were bounty hunters. Or maybe they were lawmen who didn't mind collecting on the side. And they were after Daniel. Suddenly, Daniel Crow's enraged shouts echoed from deeper in the woods, closer than she expected. "Eleyanina, you can't hide from me forever." The lawmen below her tensed, drawing their weapons. The leader, the man they called Porter, grinned a wolfish grin. "Sounds like our boy is getting frustrated." They spurred their horses, heading toward the sound of Daniel's voice. And in that moment, Elelanina was faced with an impossible choice. She could stay hidden and let these men capture or kill Daniel. It would be justice. He had betrayed her, planned to hand her over to his brother to be murdered. He deserved whatever was coming to him. Or she could warn him. The thought was insane. Why would she help the man who was her captor? But a cold, practical logic cut through her, fear and anger. These men weren't here for her. They'd made that clear. Once they had Daniel, what would they do with her? A witness to their brand of frontier justice? A woman alone in the mountains? She was a complication they wouldn't want. And there was something else. Daniel, for all his lies, had saved her life. He had stitched her wound, kept her from bleeding out in the canyon. These men, they had the same cold, dead eyes as the outlaws who'd attacked the coach. She made her decision in a heartbeat. As the lawmen disappeared into the trees, she scrambled from her hiding place and ran, not away from Daniel's voice, but toward it. "Daniel!" she screamed, her voice raw. "It's a trap. They're here. They're hunting you." She burst through a clearing and saw him. He was standing with his back to a rock wall, his revolver in his hand, his face a mask of fury. The burn on his side was ugly, raw. When he saw her, his expression shifted from rage to disbelief. "What are you doing?" he snarled. They're bounty hunters, she gasped, stumbling toward him. They want you, dead or alive. Before he could answer, a rifle shot cracked from the trees. A chip of rock exploded from the wall just inches from his head. Daniel grabbed her, shoving her behind him as he fired back into the forest. Get down! The clearing erupted into a firefight. Bullets whizzed past them, thudding into trees and ricocheting off rocks. It was the canyon all over again. Daniel fought with a cold, desperate fury, a man with nothing left to lose. He was a terrifyingly good shot, but he was outnumbered. Porter! He yelled, his voice raw with a history she didn't understand. Is this how you do things now? Hiding in the trees? A voice called back, dripping with contempt. I do what it takes to bring in scum like you and your brother, Crow. Another bullet slammed into the rock near them. They were pinned down. Daniel glanced at her, his eyes wild. Why? He breathed, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. Why did you come back? Because I don't want to die out here, she shot back. And right now, you're the only chance I've got. A strange, unreadable expression crossed his face. He looked at her, then at the trees where the unseen shooters were closing in. He seemed to come to a decision. Stay close, he muttered. He grabbed a spare cylinder from his belt and reloaded his revolver with blinding speed. Then he did something she never expected. He grabbed her hand, his grip like iron. When I move, you move. And with a roar, he broke from cover, not running away from the gunfire, but directly toward it, pulling her with him. They plunged into the trees, bullets cutting through the leaves around them. It was suicide. It was insane. And it was their only chance. They were no longer captor and prisoner. They were allies, bound by a common enemy, running for their lives together. And as they ran, Elena realized the horrifying truth. She had escaped from one monster only to throw her lot in with another, and the law itself was the thing that was going to get them both killed. They ran. It was a desperate, stumbling flight through the dense pines with gunfire cracking behind them. Daniel seemed to know the woods like the back of his hand, leading her down game trails and through narrow ravines she never would have found on her own. He was still holding her hand, his grip unyielding, pulling her along when her wounded leg threatened to give out. They finally tumbled into a shallow, moss-lined ditch, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. Daniel released her hand and pressed his back against the damp earth, his revolver still clutched in his fist, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above them. The burn on his side was seeping blood through his scorched shirt. They won't give up, he said, his voice a low rasp. Porter never gives up. Who is he? Elena asked, trying to catch her breath. A U.S. Marshal, Daniel said, a bitter twist to his lips. Or he was. Now he's just a man with a grudge. He glanced at her, his storm gray eyes sharp, analytical. You could have let them take me. Why didn't you? They said dead or alive, she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. I didn't like their odds on alive, and I figured my odds were even worse. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, then vanished. You're a gambler. I'm a survivor, she corrected him, and right now we need each other to do that. You know these mountains? I know how to patch up a wound before it kills you. She gestured to the seeping burn on his side. And that one's going to get infected if we don't clean it. He stared at her for a long moment, a silent battle raging behind his eyes. The man who had planned to trade her for his own safety was gone. In his place was a cornered outlaw weighing his options. Finally, he gave a curt nod. There's an old trapper's lean-to a mile north of here. If we can make it, we can lie low until dark. Then we need to move, she said, pushing herself up. The alliance was unspoken, fragile, and born of pure necessity. He was still her enemy, the brother of the man who led the massacre. But he was also her shield, and she, the woman he'd betrayed, was now his medic. The journey to the lean-to was a slow, agonizing crawl. Elena had to stop every few minutes, the pain in her leg a white-hot agony. Daniel, grimacing against the pain in his side, never complained. He simply waited, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The lean-to was little more than a pile of rotting logs half swallowed by the forest floor, but it was cover. Inside, the air was musty and damp. Elena immediately tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat. I need water, and the whiskey from your flask. He handed her the flask without a word. She poured the raw spirit directly onto the burn. He hissed, his body going rigid, but he didn't make another sound. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady as she cleaned and bandaged the wound as best she could. When she was done, they sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest. "This isn't just about a bounty, is it?" she asked softly. "You and Porter. It's personal." Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "My brother, Silas. He wasn't always like this," he began, his voice low, distant. "We were close once. Then the war came. It changed him, broke something inside him. He picked up a twig, snapping it between his fingers. After we tried to make a go of it, ranching. But Silas had a taste for easy money. He fell in with a bad crowd. I tried to pull him out, but he dragged me in instead." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a pain that went deeper than any burn. "The robbery that got this price put on my head, it went bad. A bank guard was killed. Silas pulled the trigger. But I was there. That makes me just as guilty in the eyes of the law." "And Porter," she prompted. "Porter was the marshal who worked the case. He made it his personal crusade. He chased us across 3 territories. During one chase, his deputy, a kid, barely 20, was shot. Porter blames me. He's been hunting me ever since, badge or no badge." The story hung in the air between them, thick with regret and violence. It didn't excuse what he'd done, what he'd planned to do to her. But for the first time, she saw the man behind the monster, a man trapped by his brother's sins and his own bad choices. "So what were you really after at the stagecoach?" she asked. "It wasn't just the gold, was it?" Daniel hesitated. "No," he admitted. "There was an iron box. Silas was supposed to grab it. Inside was a ledger." "A ledger?" "It belongs to a man named Judge Allister. Runs the whole territory from his back pocket. Mining claims, railroad contracts. He's got his hands in everything, legal and not. The ledger has the proof. Names, dates, payoffs. Silas was going to use it to blackmail him." He fell silent again. "And you?" she asked. "What did you want with it?" "I wanted to give it to the law," he said, and the bitter irony in his voice was unmistakable. "I thought, if I could bring down someone like Alistair, someone untouchable, maybe it would balance the scales. Maybe it would be enough to buy me a clean slate, a pardon. A plan born of desperation, a long shot at redemption. And she had been the complication that ruined it all." "So the ledger is still out there," she said. "Silas doesn't have it." "No," Daniel said, "which means he'll be looking for it. And he'll be looking for you. He'll think you have it." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. She wasn't just a witness to a massacre anymore. In the eyes of Silas Crow, she was the key to a fortune. And in the eyes of Marshal Porter, she was an accomplice to a wanted fugitive. There was no one to rescue her. No one was coming. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Porter will find us, and your brother will be hunting us too." "I know," Daniel said, his gaze fixed on the fading light outside the lean-to. "There's only one place to go, Aspen Ridge." "The town where you're the sheriff?" she asked, the sarcasm sharp. "It's the last place they'll expect me to go," he countered. "And it's where Porter will take his men to resupply. We need to get there first. We need to get the drop on him." "And then what?" she demanded. "We don't just walk away from this, Daniel. We have to finish it." A new resolve hardened his face. He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt like they were truly on the same side. "No," he said, his voice cold as iron. "We don't walk away. We get that ledger. We expose Porter for the man he is, and we make damn sure my brother never hurts anyone again." As darkness fell, they slipped out of the lean-to and began the treacherous journey to Aspen Ridge. They were a strange pair, a Boston-trained medic with a bullet hole in her leg, and a wanted outlaw with a burn on his side. They were hunted, wounded, and hopelessly outgunned. But for the first time, they weren't just running from the past. They were running toward a reckoning. The journey to Aspen Ridge was a special kind of hell. They moved only at night, sticking to the shadows, every sense on high alert. By day they hid, cold and hungry, listening for the sound of horses that would signal their end. Elelena's leg was a constant, throbbing agony, and Daniel's burn was beginning to look angry, the edges red and inflamed. They were a mess of bandages and grim determination. During one of their daytime hiding spots, tucked away in a cave behind a frozen waterfall, Daniel finally confronted the question that had been hanging between them. When this is over, assuming we're not dead, what will you do? Testify, she said without hesitation. Against you? Against your brother, against Porter, against anyone who had a hand in what happened at that canyon. And me? He pressed, his gaze intense. The law will still want you, Daniel. She met his eyes, her own expression unreadable. You saved my life, and I saved yours. That makes us even. After that, I'll tell the truth. All of it. I'll let the chips fall where they may. It wasn't the promise of loyalty he might have hoped for, but it was honest. And in their world of lies and betrayal, honesty was a rare and valuable currency. They reached the outskirts of Aspen Ridge just before the third dawn, slipping into the sleeping town like ghosts. The sheriff's office was dark. Daniel still had a key. Inside, it smelled of stale coffee and dust. It was a surreal feeling, standing in the heart of the law with a wanted man. Porter will set up here, Daniel whispered, moving silently through the dark room. He'll use the telegraph to report in, gather supplies. We have to be ready. Elena found the small infirmary in the back, a room with little more than a cot and a cabinet of basic supplies. It was a pathetic excuse for a medical facility, but to her it was an arsenal. She found carbolic acid, clean bandages, and sutures. She set about properly treating Daniel's burn, her movements efficient and professional. You were lying, weren't you? She said as she worked, her voice low. About your wife and daughter. Daniel flinched, not from the sting of the acid, but from the question. He stared at the wall, his jaw tight. No, he said, his voice thick with a grief that was terrifyingly real. That part was true. Stagecoach robbery. 8 years ago. I left out the part where it was my brother's gang that did it. The confession hit her harder than any of his other lies. This wasn't just a story he'd concocted to gain her sympathy. It was the wound that defined him, the ghost that truly haunted him. Silas was there, she whispered. He didn't know it was them until it was over, Daniel said, his voice cracking. He saw their faces. It broke him. It broke us. He took the money from that robbery and vanished. I started hunting him. He thought I was coming for revenge, but I was trying to find the last piece of my family I had left. This changed everything. His quest wasn't for redemption. It was for his brother. All of it. The hunt for the ledger, the plan for a pardon. It was all a desperate attempt to pull his brother back from the abyss, or put him down for good. Before she could process this new devastating truth, they heard hoofbeats outside. Porter. They had arrived just in time. Daniel shoved her into the infirmary. Stay here, don't make a sound. He moved to the front of the office, melting into the shadows beside the door, his revolver in his hand. The office door opened, and Marshal Porter strode in, followed by his 2 men, Cooper and Mitch. They were loud, confident, stomping the dust from their boots. He's vanished, Porter growled, throwing his hat on the desk. Like a damn ghost. But he'll surface. Men like Crow always do. What about the girl? Mitch asked. If we find him, we find her. Porter's reply was cold, dismissive. She's a loose end. We deal with her when the time comes. From her hiding spot, Elena felt a chill crawl up her spine. Porter wasn't a lawman, he was an executioner. The men started talking, planning their next move. They were going to wait for a telegraph from Judge Allister, confirming their next steps. The judge himself was orchestrating the hunt. The ledger wasn't just a threat to him, it was a loose cannon, and he'd hired Porter to make it disappear, along with anyone who knew about it. Suddenly, Elena noticed something. A second door in the infirmary, one she hadn't seen before. It probably led to a back alley, an escape route. She could slip out, disappear into the chaos of the frontier, and leave Daniel to his fate. It was the smart play, the safe play. But she thought of the elderly couple on the stagecoach, of the young man named Clark. She thought of Daniel's wife and daughter. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. While Porter and his men were distracted, she slipped back into the main office, silent as a shadow. Daniel saw her and his eyes widened in a silent, furious question. She ignored him. She moved to the sheriff's desk, where Porter had carelessly tossed his saddlebags. Her hands didn't tremble as she reached inside, her fingers searching for something, anything, she could use. She found a leather pouch. Inside was not money, but a stack of telegrams. She scanned the top one. It was from Judge Allister, and the words made her blood run cold. Crow brothers and witness are secondary. Primary objective is ledger, recover at all costs. Silence anyone who has seen it. I've sent reinforcements. ETA tomorrow. Reinforcements. This wasn't just Porter and his two men. An entire kill squad was on its way, sent by the most powerful man in the territory. They weren't just hunting Daniel. They were hunting her. And then she saw it. At the very bottom of the last telegram, a handwritten note from Porter to the judge. Don't worry about the witness. I have an asset on the inside. My man in Crow's gang says she hasn't seen the ledger. He'll deliver her and the book as soon as he finds it. An asset. A man on the inside. And there was only one person it could be. Silas Crow wasn't just trying to blackmail the judge. He was working for him. He had been from the start. The whole thing, the Stagecoach Massacre, it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a planned assassination, designed to retrieve that ledger, and Silas was the judge's hired gun. She looked up from the telegram, her eyes locking with Daniel's across the dark room. And in that moment, he saw the look on her face, and he knew. He knew that the entire world he thought he understood, the story of his brother's fall from grace, his own quest for redemption, was a lie. His brother wasn't a broken man. He was a monster working for an even bigger one. And they were caught in the middle, with an army of killers about to descend on the town. The revelation settled in the dusty air of the sheriff's office, heavy and suffocating. Silas, the broken brother, was a lie. He was a hired killer, and the massacre was a job. Daniel looked like he'd been punched in the gut, the foundation of his 8-year quest crumbling into dust. My brother works for Allister? He whispered, the words full of dawning horror. Elena could only nod, the telegram clutched in her hand. In the front room, Porter and his men were still talking, their voices a low murmur. They had no idea the fugitives they were hunting were just a few feet away, unraveling a conspiracy that went far deeper than a simple bounty. Reinforcements are coming, she mouthed silently to Daniel. Tomorrow. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm them. They were trapped in a town that was about to become a war zone. Running was no longer an option. The only way out was through. A new fire lit in Daniel's eyes, replacing the grief. It was the cold, hard flame of pure rage. The target of his vengeance had just shifted from a broken brother to a cabal of powerful, corrupt men. The telegraph, he breathed, his mind racing. We need to send a message. To who? There's one man Porter fears more than anyone. A territorial marshal named Clay Rourke. He's old school, incorruptible. If I can get a message to him in Denver, he might get here before Allister's men do. How do we get to the telegraph office without being seen? She asked. Just then, a loud crash echoed from the street, followed by shouting. A drunken brawl had spilled out of the saloon. It was the diversion they needed. Now, Daniel said, grabbing her arm. They slipped out the back door of the infirmary and into the alley. Sticking to the shadows, they moved like wraiths through the sleeping town, the sounds of the brawl covering their footsteps. The telegraph office was at the far end of the main street, a small, dark building. The lights were off, the operator long since gone home. Daniel jimmied the lock with his knife, and they slipped inside. The air was thick with the smell of ozone. Daniel moved immediately to the telegraph key, his fingers hovering over it. I know the call signs, he muttered, but it'll take time. You have to keep watch. Elena stood by the front window, peering through a crack in the curtains. The street was quieting down, the brawl dying out. Her heart hammered against her ribs with every passing second. She could hear the frantic clicking of the telegraph key behind her. Daniel tapping out his desperate plea for help. Click, 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 click. Each sound was a beat in a countdown to their own deaths. Suddenly, she saw movement across the street. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the general store. It was Cooper, the silent tracker from Porter's posse. He was staring directly at the telegraph office. He hadn't seen them, not yet, but he was suspicious. The light from the moon caught something in his hand. Not a gun. It was a small carved bird. He put it to his lips, and a perfect sharp bird call echoed through the night, the signal from the mountains. But what did it mean? Was he signaling Porter? Before she could warn Daniel, the front door of the sheriff's office opened. Porter and Mitch stepped out, guns drawn. Cooper pointed directly at the telegraph office. They'd been made. "Daniel, they know!" she hissed. He didn't stop, his fingers flying faster across the key. "Almost there. Just need confirmation." The front door of the telegraph office burst open, slamming against the wall. Porter stood there, his face a mask of cold fury, his revolver leveled at Daniel's back. "Get away from the key, Crow." Daniel's hands froze. Slowly he turned around. "It's over, Porter. The message is sent. Rourke is coming." Porter laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think a message is going to save you? By the time Rourke gets here, you'll be buried in an unmarked grave, and this whole town will have forgotten you ever existed." Mitch stepped up behind him, his own gun trained on Ella Lenina. "And the girl?" Porter's eyes flickered to her, cold and dismissive. "She knows too much. She goes in the same grave." But then something unexpected happened. Cooper, who had followed them across the street, stepped into the doorway. He wasn't looking at Daniel or Ella Lenina. His gaze was fixed on Porter. "Marshal," Cooper said, his voice quiet but firm, "this ain't justice. This is an execution." Porter whirled on him, his face contorted with rage. "You stay out of this, tracker. You're getting paid to follow orders, not ask questions." "I took an oath," Cooper said, his hand moving slowly toward the gun on his hip. "And it wasn't to Judge Allister. It was the moment that changed everything." Mitch, ever the loyal dog, turned his gun on Cooper. "Don't be a fool, old man." The office was a powder keg, a four-way standoff. Daniel and Elelanana were unarmed and exposed. Porter and Mitch were ready to kill, and Cooper, the quiet man, was about to make a stand. Daniel seized the fractional moment of distraction. He kicked the chair he was sitting on, sending it skittering across the floor and crashing into Mitch's legs. Mitch stumbled, his shot going wild, shattering the window. In that same instant, Cooper drew his weapon. He was lightning fast. He fired once. Mitch crumpled to the floor, a look of surprise on his face. Porter, roaring with rage, fired at Cooper. But Daniel was already moving, tackling Porter around the waist, driving him back out into the street. The two men crashed to the ground in a desperate, violent struggle. Elelanena scrambled for Mitch's fallen revolver. Her hands closed around the cold, heavy steel. She ran outside. Daniel and Porter were rolling in the dirt, trading blows. Daniel was weakened by his wound, and Porter was fighting with the savagery of a cornered animal. He managed to pin Daniel, his hands closing around Daniel's throat. Daniel's face began to turn purple. Elelanena raised the gun, her hands shaking. "Get off him!" she screamed. Porter glanced up at her, a sneer on his face. "You don't have the nerve, girl." It was the same thing Silas had said, the same arrogant belief that she was weak. And just like before, they were wrong. She fired. The bullet tore through the dirt just inches from Porter's head. He flinched, and that was all the opening Daniel needed. He heaved with all his remaining strength, throwing Porter off him. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing Porter's gun. The fight was over. Cooper stood over the body of Mitch, his face grim. The town was beginning to stir, windows lighting up, people shouting. They had won the battle, but they both knew the war was far from over. Allister's reinforcements were still coming, and somewhere out in the darkness, Silas Crow was still hunting for his ledger and for the last witness who could connect him to it all. They had exposed the conspiracy, but in doing so, they had painted a target on the entire town of Aspen Ridge. The town of Aspen Ridge woke up to the sound of a gunshot and found itself in the middle of a war it didn't know was being fought. People poured out of their homes, lanterns held high, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. They found Marshal Porter disarmed and bound, his face a bloody mask of fury, and his deputy Mitch lying dead in the doorway of the telegraph office. Daniel Crow, a wanted man, stood over them with a gun in his hand, and next to him was the strange woman from the Stagecoach Massacre. It was a scene that defied all logic. Cooper, the tracker whose quiet presence the townspeople had barely registered, was the one who spoke first. His voice was calm and carried the weight of authority. "James Porter is no lawman," he announced to the gathered crowd. "He's a hired gun for Judge Alastair, and he was sent here to bury a crime, not solve one." He explained everything, his words simple and direct. He told them about the ledger, about Alastair's corruption, about the reinforcements that were on their way to silence not just the witnesses, but anyone who got in their way. Fear rippled through the crowd. These were miners, shopkeepers, and ranchers. They weren't fighters. "What do you want us to do?" a blacksmith called out, his voice shaking. "Run?" It was Elena who answered, her voice ringing out in the cold night air, clear and strong. "You can't run from men like this," she said, stepping forward. "If you run, they'll hunt you down one by one. But if you stand, if you fight together, you have a chance." She looked around at their faces, seeing the doubt, the terror. "I'm not a fighter. I'm a medic. But I saw what these men did in that canyon. I won't let it happen again. I won't let it happen to your homes, to your families." Daniel stepped beside her. He looked out at the townspeople, not as a wanted outlaw, but as a man who had lost everything to the very corruption that was now at their doorstep. "I know I'm not the man you thought I was," he said, his voice raw, "but I'm telling you the truth now. Alistair's men are coming. They won't leave any witnesses. Your only chance is to fortify this town and hold them off until Marshal Rourke arrives from Denver." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a crazy plan, a suicide mission. But as they looked at the dead man on the ground and the bound traitor, they knew it was the truth. The blacksmith was the first to step forward. "The sheriff's office has a rifle locker, and I've got a shotgun of my own." One by one, others joined him. The shopkeeper who was a veteran of the war, the miners who knew how to handle dynamite, the women who could load rifles and tend to the wounded. The town of Aspen Ridge, a sleepy dot on a map, was becoming an army. They had less than a day. Under Daniel's command, they turned the town into a fortress. Wagons were overturned to create barricades on the main street. Men with rifles took up positions on the rooftops. The miners, led by Cooper, went to work setting strategic charges at the narrow mountain pass that was the only way into town. Elena turned the small hotel into a makeshift field hospital, organizing the town's women, tearing sheets for bandages, boiling water for sterilization. She was back in her element, a commander in a different kind of war. She and Daniel worked side by side, a strange, unspoken understanding passing between them. The betrayals and lies hadn't vanished, but they had been superseded by a desperate, shared purpose. In a quiet moment, as she was bandaging his hand, which he'd cut during the fight, he looked at her. "After this," he said, "if we're still here, I'll turn myself in. I'll face the music for what I did." "First, we have to survive," she replied softly. "Then we'll worry about the music." As dusk began to fall, a lone rider was spotted approaching the pass. It wasn't Alastair's men. It was Silas Crow. He rode in under a white flag, a gesture so out of character it was terrifying. He stopped just outside the first barricade, his eyes scanning the fortified town. "Daniel!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "I know you're in there, brother. I have a proposal." Daniel appeared at the barricade, his rifle held ready. "I have nothing to say to you, Silas." "Oh, I think you do," Silas called back, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You see, I know you don't have the ledger, and Porter doesn't have it, which means it's still out there, in the wreckage of that coach. I'm going to get it, but Judge Alastair wants the girl. He wants the witness silenced permanently. So here's my offer. You give me the girl, and I'll let you in this town live. I'll even give you a head start before Alastair's men arrive. You know they're coming. Refuse, and we'll burn this town to the ground together." Elena stood beside Daniel, her face pale but resolute. She had become the single bargaining chip in a war she never wanted. The townspeople behind the barricade looked at her, then at Daniel. Their loyalty was to their homes, their families. The temptation to sacrifice the outsider must have been immense. Daniel looked at his brother, the man whose ghost he had chased for 8 long years, and he saw him for what he was. Not a broken soul to be saved, but a hollow man, a monster. "She's not going anywhere," Daniel yelled back, his voice like flint. "You want her? You'll have to come through me. You'll have to come through all of us." Silas's smile vanished. "Have it your way, brother," he snarled. He turned his horse and rode back toward the pass. The offer was a lie, of course. He would have killed them all anyway. But he had wanted to break his brother's spirit first. As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley, they saw them. A small army of riders, at least 30 of them, cresting the pass. Alistair's men, with Silas Crow at their head. The siege of Aspen Ridge had begun. Daniel turned to Elelanina, his face grim in the fading light. "Stay in the hospital," he ordered. "No," she said, picking up a rifle from a crate. "I'm a survivor, remember? I'm seeing this through to the end." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and he didn't argue. As the first shots rang out, they stood together, 2 broken people who had found something worth fighting for in the ruins of their lives. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and their only hope was a prayer sent over a telegraph wire. But they were standing, and they would not fall without a fight. The first wave of Alistair's men came at dusk, a frontal assault meant to overwhelm the town with sheer numbers. They charged down the main street, firing from the saddle, expecting the townspeople to break and run. They were wrong. The street erupted. From the rooftops, from behind the barricades, a volley of rifle fire tore into the attackers. Riders tumbled from their horses, their charge faltering into chaos. They hadn't expected an organized defense. They hadn't expected a fight. Daniel was a general in his element, his voice shouting commands that cut through the roar of gunfire. He moved along the barricade, directing fire, steadying nerves. Cooper, from his perch on the hotel roof, was a silent specter of death, his long rifle picking off riders with methodical precision. The attackers fell back, regrouping at the edge of town, leaving half a dozen of their men dead or wounded in the street. A cheer went up from the defenders, but it was short-lived. This was just the beginning. The real battle began under the cover of darkness. Alistair's men were professionals. They dismounted, using the buildings and shadows to advance, trying to flank the town's defenses. Gunfights broke out in the alleys on the boardwalks. It was close, brutal work. Elelanina was in the makeshift hospital, and it quickly filled with the wounded. A miner with a shattered arm, a shopkeeper with a bullet in his gut. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, her medical training taking over completely. She directed the other women, her voice calm and authoritative as she packed wounds, set bones, and stitched torn flesh. She was saving lives while Daniel was taking them. They were 2 sides of the same coin. Hours bled into one another. The town held, but the cost was high. The defenders were running low on ammunition, and their numbers were dwindling. Elelanena saw the exhaustion and fear on the faces of the men who came back from the line. Then came the fire. The attackers started flinging torches onto the roofs of the wooden buildings. The general store went up first, the flames licking into the night sky, casting a hellish, flickering light over the whole town. Panic began to set in. They could fight men, but they couldn't fight the fire. It was then that Silas Crow made his move. While the main force kept the defenders pinned down, he and a small group of his most loyal men used the chaos to sneak in through the back of the town, heading for one target: the hotel, the hospital. He knew his brother. He knew Daniel would have put Elelanena where he thought she'd be safest. And Silas knew that Elelanena was Daniel's one weakness. The back door of the hotel splintered open. Silas stormed in, his face demonic in the firelight, a revolver in each hand. The women screamed. The wounded men on the cots tried to rise. "Looking for you, sweetheart," Silas snarled, his eyes locking on Elelanena. She stood frozen for a second, a bloody bandage in her hand. Then her training, her instincts, kicked in. She threw a bottle of carbolic acid from her medical tray directly at his face. He screamed as the acid splashed across his eyes, stumbling back, firing blindly. His men pushed past him into the room. But Elelanena was ready. Tucked into the waistband of her skirt was the revolver she'd taken from Mitch. She pulled it out and fired. She wasn't a good shot, not like Daniel. Her first shot went wide, but her second hit one of the outlaws in the chest. He staggered back, a look of shock on his face, and fell. Her shot alerted Daniel. He had seen the fire at the hotel and was already running toward it. He burst in through the front entrance just as Silas, rubbing furiously at his burning eyes, raised his pistol to fire at Elena again. "Silas!" Daniel roared. The two brothers faced each other in the heart of the burning hotel, surrounded by the wounded and the dying, the culmination of 8 years of hatred and grief. "You should have given her to me, Danny boy," Silas screamed, his vision blurry. "She was the price. You could have walked away." "There's no walking away from what you are," Daniel said, his voice cold with a final, terrible certainty. He raised his rifle. "This ends now." The two men fired at the same time, a double explosion that seemed to shake the building to its foundations. Silas was thrown backward, a dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He hit the floor, dead before his gun stopped smoking. Daniel stood for a second, then swayed, clutching his side. A dark stain was spreading across his shirt. He'd been hit. Elena rushed to him, helping him to the floor, her hands immediately going to the wound. "It's bad, Daniel," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. He looked up at her, his face pale, a faint smile on his lips. "I found him," he whispered. "I finally found him." Outside, the fire was spreading. Alistair's men were pressing their advantage, sensing the defense was faltering. The end seemed near. But then, a new sound cut through the night. Not gunfire. A bugle call. Clear, sharp, and beautiful. On the ridge overlooking the pass, dozens of dark figures appeared, silhouetted against the dawn sky. Blue-coated cavalry. At their head was an old, ramrod-straight man with a sweeping white mustache. Marshal Clay Rourke had arrived. Alistair's men, caught between the town's defenders and the federal marshals, broke in a panic. They tried to flee, but Rourke's men were relentless, riding them down. The siege was broken. The battle for Aspen Ridge was over. Elena didn't see any of it. Her entire world was the man bleeding on the floor in front of her. She pressed her hands to his wound, trying to will the blood to stop. "Hold on, Daniel," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to leave me now. Hold on." His eyes were starting to glaze over, his breathing shallow. He had finally confronted his brother, had saved the town, but it had cost him everything. And as the sun rose over the smoking, battered remains of Aspen Ridge, Elena. Hayes was about to lose the one person she had fought so hard to save. The infirmary was a scene from a nightmare. The wounded lay on cots, on the floor, their groans a constant low symphony of pain. But Elena heard none of it. Her focus was entirely on Daniel, his lifeblood seeping out between her fingers. The bullet had torn through his side, and she knew with a sickening certainty that it had done terrible damage. Marshal Rourke, his face grim, stood in the doorway. "How is he?" "He's dying," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. She was a medic again, not a woman in love. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. "The bullet is deep. I can't stop the bleeding without surgery, and I don't have the tools." "I have a surgeon with my company," Rourke said. "He's 2 hours behind us with the supply wagon." "He won't last 2 hours," she stated, the words like stones in her mouth. She looked up at the old marshal, her eyes blazing with a desperate fire. "But I can try. I need clean cloths, boiled water, and all the light you can give me. Now." For the next 2 hours she fought. She fought with a ferocity that stunned everyone who watched. Using a sterilized hunting knife and a pair of forceps from a deputy's gun cleaning kit, she did what she had only ever read about in medical textbooks back in Boston. It was brutal, bloody, and nothing short of miraculous. She found the bullet lodged against his kidney, and with hands that did not tremble, she removed it. She tied off the bleeders, stitching him closed with fishing line that had been soaked in whiskey. When she was done, she collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Daniel was alive, barely. His breathing was a shallow rasp, but he was alive. Rourke looked at her with a new, profound respect. "In all my years," he said, his voice full of awe, I've never seen anything like it. The aftermath of the siege was grim. Aspen Ridge was battered, half burned, but its people were alive. They had fought and won. Judge Alistair's corruption was exposed. The ledger, combined with Porter's coerced testimony, was enough to bring down his entire empire. He was arrested, his reign of terror over. Daniel Crowe, the wanted man, became the hero of Aspen Ridge. The story of his stand and the towns became a legend in the territory. Marshal Rourke, after hearing the full story from Elelonena and Cooper, sent a telegram to the governor. Daniel Crowe received a full pardon. He woke up 3 days later. The first thing he saw was Elelonena, asleep in a chair by his bed, her face pale and exhausted. He reached out a weak hand and touched her hair. Her eyes fluttered open. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice a dry crackle. "I told you I would," she said, a tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, for Daniel and for the town. The people of Aspen Ridge began to rebuild, their shared ordeal forging a bond stronger than steel. Daniel slowly regained his strength, with Elelonena by his side every step of the way. They talked for hours, laying bare all the secrets, all the pain, all the ghosts that had stood between them. They had been forged in violence and betrayal, but in the quiet aftermath, something new began to grow. Something gentle and strong. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Daniel, leaning on a cane, walked with her to the edge of town. They stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, the rebuilt town glowing with lamplight below. "The town council asked me to stay on," he said quietly, "as sheriff." She looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Are you going to accept?" "Only if you'll stay with me," he said, turning to face her. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have any fine words. He just had himself, a man pulled back from the brink, his heart full of scars, but beating steady and true. "Elelonena Hayes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life. You saved this town. You saved me from myself. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, Daniel, I will." They were married a month later in the newly rebuilt town hall. The whole town was there. Cooper, the silent tracker, stood as Daniel's best man. Marshal Rourke himself came all the way from Denver to give the bride away. They rebuilt Daniel's cabin in the pines, but it was no longer a hideout. It was a home. He served as the sheriff of Aspen Ridge for 30 years, a man known for his quiet strength and unwavering sense of justice. Elelonena became the town's official doctor, her steady hands and compassionate heart a comfort to generations. They had children, a boy with his father's storm gray eyes, and a girl with her mother's fierce determination. They filled the small cabin with a love and laughter that chased away the last of the shadows. Years later, an old Daniel and an old Elelonena sat on their porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard below. The sun was setting, painting the jagged peaks of the Rockies in hues of golden rose, the same peaks that had once been a place of terror and death. He took her hand, his touch still as sure and gentle as it had been all those years ago. "I never thought I'd see this," he said, his voice thick with age and contentment. "A life, a family, peace." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We fought for it," she said softly. "It hurt, too much sometimes." He squeezed her hand, a familiar smile on his face. "That's why I was here." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the vast Colorado sky. Theirs was a love story born from a massacre, a bond forged in lies and gunfire, and a life built on the impossible, beautiful truth that sometimes the deepest wounds can lead to the greatest healing. Their story became a quiet legend, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of canyons, a single flicker of hope, of courage, of love, can be enough to lead you home. If you enjoyed this story of survival, betrayal, and the long road to redemption, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next strange tale.